ahead.
All right. So, my name is Stephen Ferguson. I'm a full professor at North Carolina State. Just recently attained. But my main areas. Yeah. Actually, that's one of those things we have to do. Dignity. Whether or not my self-worth is tied to me getting full professor. Mainly.
That's that social dignity right there.
But mainly my work is in the area of Marxism, social political philosophy, and I've written a number of books, both as a sole author and co-author with John McClendon. So we've done a history of African American philosophers. We wrote a book on philosophy of sports, Beyond the White Shadow, philosophy, sports, and the African American experience. And so I think in a lot of ways my experience as a philosopher comes out of a very unique, distinctive experience, because I recognize that there are African American philosophers who don't write about race, the philosophy of the black experience, but there are African American philosophers who write about that experience. And I say that because when we think about the significance of this moment, and I want to kind of formally extend a thank you to Anthony and to Leonard, because these are the types of conversations that we need to have if we're going to start building a canon within African American philosophy. And it means that we have to begin to take our own thinkers, we have to take their philosophical thought seriously and begin to examine it in the same way that we've spent eons talking about Hume's one-line sentence in a footnote. In the same way in which we rigorously go after Hegel for his racism, which would be kind of interesting because my argument is in the Hegelian tradition, I'm doing a dialectical analysis of the concept of dignity. But I do want to thank both of you because this is a kind of seminal kind of way in which I think we can approach canon reformation in terms of the larger field, is by actually taking African American philosophers and thinkers, taking their thought, their philosophical thought seriously, and bringing it to bear on these kind of categories and concepts and themes that we've traditionally looked at. So in some ways, I have a broader conception of what African American philosophy can be. As a kind of autobiographical note, I don't know if Leonard remembers this, but the actual first time I met Leonard was in 1993. And I happened to be a student activist at the University of Missouri, and we were fighting to get a new culture center built. And Purdue had one of the culture centers that we were going to try to model our design off of at the University of Missouri. We didn't just want it to be a hangout spot for black students, we also wanted it to be somewhat of a research center. And as I recall it, when I first met Leonard, I actually already knew him because I had been given a copy of Philosophy Born of Struggle by my own mentor, John McClendon. And as I would find out later, both John and Leonard went to Central State together. Leonard was before John in some respect, but I began to develop earlier on in the 1990s this kind of intricate view that despite the fact that African American philosophers often talk about the isolation of being in the academy, the exclusion, there was a community of black philosophers that existed, and they were having conversations with each other. And so we've had these moments over the years, particularly by way of Philosophy Born of Struggle, where both, as they now use this language in the philosophy of education, they talk about the second curriculum. There were these conversations that were going on when papers were presented, but then there was also these conversations going on as we cuss and discuss over meals. And so in a similar kind of way, as I was thinking about this, the kind of concept of dignity, I wanted to kind of have a similar kind of discussion to use a kind of non-academic parlance to kind of riff off of the point that Leonard is getting at, which in my estimation, based on conversations I've had with Leonard, reading his stuff, and also talking with Anthony, one of these kind of issues that emerges when we talk about dignity is, how does dignity stand in relationship to performances, practices such as minstrelsy? Why is it that someone, if we make the presupposition that someone has an inherent sense of self-worth, why would they intentionally degrade themselves, right? As you can see with the quote that I pulled from Huey Newton, and it's kind of interesting as I was thinking about this, it's like all of these references in African-American intellectual culture to this notion of dignity, but Huey says, and this is in the context of revolutionary suicide, he said, but before we die, how shall we live? I say with hope and dignity. And I think that's profound because it gets at this kind of notion that we all assume, to kind of borrow Hegel's language, is kind of almost like, as we were talking about Ed's paper, it is almost a presuppositionless beginning that we accept the fact that every human being has a sense of self-worth. Now, clearly, when we look at the historical record, the only way that that could emerge is because of bourgeois revolutions that called into question feudal hierarchical kind of status ways in which we organize society, that rather than see the church, the king, blah, 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 we begin to see a kind of playing field in which all humanity has an inherent sense of dignity. So there's a historical development here. But if we look at this dialectically, it's kind of interesting, as I normally don't write this way. It strikes me too much as analytical philosophy, but I wanted to make a presentation to kind of make it digestible as I was going through it. So in one sense, if we think about the kind of, on the one hand, the way I've been laying this out, as Leonard lays out very clearly in his article on dignity, when we, traditionally think about these notions of dignity, we traditionally go back to the UN and their Declaration on Human Rights. And so we get this kind of sense, as I've tried to lay out with this first thesis here, about the universality of dignity. All human beings possess an inherent sense of dignity, and we could use the notion of self-worth. Dignity is the lived expression of the universal human essence, which I know many of you may have problems with that kind of language about a universal human essence. But in a Marxist sense, when I'm thinking of this notion of the human essence, I'm thinking of the collective capacity to labor, create, and participate in social life as free and equal members of society, right? And when you look at Marx, and there's elements of this in Engels and also Lenin, there's a very clear sense that one of the socialist principles that they're thinking of in terms of equality, but it doesn't sound like, justice is fairness or any of that garbage. Marx, Engels, and Lenin is very clear: from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So there's a kind of need-based sense in which they're thinking about being free and equal members of society. This essence, this universal human essence, is historically mediated through the social relations of production and can only be realized when those relations permit free and equal participation. So first conclusion I want to reach here is that dignity is rooted in humanity's collective capacity to transform society, but not in abstract rights, but in concrete social relations. And I think this, if we look at the historical context for the UN Declaration on Independence, we can see why this begins to emerge historically, is because after World War II and the devastation that was caused by the Holocaust, there's a kind of world reckoning that we need to reset, recalibrate how we're thinking about human relationships, right? Now, obviously though, as we all are much aware, there's also the antithetical position here that despite the fact that we talk about this universal human essence, the fact that everyone has dignity, we also recognize that we live in civil societies, we live in countries, and language I'll use is multinational states, in which dignity does not exist or people are denied dignity in that respect. So clearly, if we were to look at the United States as our starting point, and this will be a very brief, but if you need me to elaborate on it, I can. If we traditionally, how we think of the United States, and I probably should phrase this as the kind of liberal framing, there's this kind of general view that the United States represents some kind of democratic experiment in which we're constantly teleologically going towards a more perfect union. I call this the kind of multiracial state view, such that even though there's been these various hiccups in history, there's this process that's unfolding, and traditionally we give the shorthand of melting pot or critical gumbo, however you want to jazz that up, right? Now, if you think about this framework, and let me be clear, and I'll name names when I say stuff like this. A contemporary version of this would be someone like Melvin Rogers, right? Melvin Rogers writes this book with the title Democratic Faith, right? He has some faith that the United States is going to live up to its bourgeois ideals of equality and freedom and justice for everybody, right? And he documents that by using various people, Toni Morrison and a range of other people. Now, clearly, if we were to look at the way that I'm framing this as a multinational state, my argument is that this is a country that was built on national oppression, class exploitation, but a central component to those two categories of national oppression and capitalist exploitation is that it presents itself in the form of racism, right? So if we think about the ideological hegemony, what the dominant narrative is of this country historically, is that this is a white man's country. White supremacy has been used as that kind of image there. But the way in which it has been developed ushers in the national oppression of various nationalities and, with or without quotation, nations. So when we think of Native Americans and the oppression that they felt, there were many nations among Native Americans. They weren't just Native Americans from the beginning, right? But it's also important, I think, in terms of understanding white supremacy, national oppression, and capitalist exploitation, to understand those forms of national oppression have differed for every group, but they may overlap. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States even to this day, right? It is considered to be a protectorate. But we cannot make the same argument that African Americans are an internal colony. African Americans, since the beginning of slavery, have been incorporated into the overall mechanism of how the country runs. So clearly, when we talk about this dynamic of what dignity means, particularly in the African American context, as we all have pointed out, there are these very interesting ways in which, when we look at the African American experience, despite national oppression, despite white supremacy, despite capitalist exploitation, African Americans have also been victims of indignity, but also have exhibited dignity. That's the contradiction, if you will, when we look at that. Oftentimes when people, I think, kind of do a bad job of the Hegelian approach, they do this antithesis, thesis, and then synthesis, but they miss out on one of the most important sections of Hegel's Science and Logic, and that's the mediation. Why I want to turn to this notion of mediation is because I think it's important how we're thinking about dignity. And here, I just haven't had enough time to kind of work this out, but I do think in terms of, if we think about how Aristotle develops these categories, these moral characters, and how he sees them in relationship to, he develops a very dynamic way in which we can look at these categories and see how someone may think that they're exhibiting courage, but they may also be exhibiting a certain kind of vice. If we look at this wider context of the multinational state, national oppression, white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, African Americans have fought or responded to what are the dominant narratives in that way, right? So if you think about it, let's say you're in the early 20th century, and we know of a lot of what they used to call lay historians, or historians without a portfolio or a PhD. There were a number of people, J. Rogers, Hubert Harrison, you go down the list, that a big part of their scholarship was demonstrating that African Americans had civilization, right? Now, why did they do that? Well, this is the dawn of American imperialism. American imperialism needs a justification for why the white man's burden is to destroy everybody else and then carry them along with them so that they can work the land, right? So what did African Americans do in response to that? Contributionism, right? Traditionally, when we think of, for example, Black History Month, what is Black History Month? Black History Month is an opportunity, mind you, who are the two people that are significant in terms of, initially it was Negro history. Who are the two people that Carter G. Woodson was thinking about for Negro history? Frederick Douglass and who else? Abraham Lincoln, right? And what was he saying? Look, I know we did this slavery thing. I know we're sharecroppers, but we are part of America. We have the same values. We have civilization just like you. Contributionism was offered as that, and it's kind of interesting. If you look at historically at the ways in which various immigrant groups have been assimilated into this country, and it's almost kind of reflexive, the way you respond to the dominant narrative of white supremacy is your counter response is what you've contributed to the country. That justifies your citizenship. In fact, it's kind of interesting. How many of you have watched John Leguizamo's documentary series called John Leguizamo Does America? Yeah. He's a comedian. He's a Latino comedian. Oh, yeah. Now, if you watch that whole narrative, his whole narrative is about, hey, Latins have been here since the beginning of time. We have contributed. We had empires down in Central and South America. We're Americans too, right? Now it's interesting, I wish I had the opportunity. A rapper by the name of Residente has done the song, This is not America. And it's a devastating critique because why? How did the United States become the monopolizer of America? Right? That's the ideological narrative. Everybody, if you were looking at in the 1700s, you would have seen tons of people thinking about the Americas as part of South America or Central America. But how is it that the United States becomes the dominant purveyor of America? So in that respect, you get this kind of counter-hegemonic narrative to tackle this whole issue about dignity. So the point I'm raising out here is that if we say dignity is at the centerpiece, what we can see is both deficient and inefficient, or deficient and excessive responses to the overall question of dignity, right? And so contributionism would be the excessive form because it ushers in a false sense of pride. And if you think about many ways in which we think about this, and here's my overall point. I'm not saying get rid of Black History Month, so don't cite me for that. What my point is that when we look at the overall project of contributionism, what is contributionism? We have to measure our dignity through Black firsts. And what's the characteristic of most of the Black firsts? They were the first Negro to get a PhD and break through the color line. And then we go, oh man, Jackie Robinson. But if we look at the real dynamics, let's just take baseball. In response to World War II, The major league owners broke up the Negro leagues, stole all the talent, revigorated what was a declining industry, because most people were more interested in seeing the inner ethnic competition between Negro league teams and predominantly white teams. So you had a Major League Baseball industry that was on the decline, and what it did was it just incorporated black talent to the best of its ability. But as many people have pointed out, and John and I point this out in our book Beyond the White Shadow, if you're looking at this from the standpoint of nationality, why didn't the major league teams incorporate the Negro leagues into Major League Baseball, keep the teams intact, keep ownership intact, and managers intact, rather than just integrate one individual, right? So you can see how even though you have the appearance of an elimination of racism, you still have the maintenance of national oppression. Because the Negro Baseball League was completely wiped out after that. Now, enter into the 1980s, when you look at Major League Baseball. Another crisis emerged. Why? Well, 80s, 90s. Another crisis emerges because now everybody's being accused of juicing because everybody's hitting home runs. How do you solve that problem? Now you get people that can really hit from Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Japan. Now here's the twist of the whole thing. Think about it. If you look at every major empire, they incorporate by way of sports. The British Empire did it by way of cricket. The United States did it by way of baseball and basketball. So when you look at Japanese players coming into the major leagues, they came in as a result of what? The growth of U.S. imperialism that spread to places like Japan, to South America. When I don't say this as like a pride, talk about pride. I don't say this as pride. My wife is Dominican. And so when we talk to a lot of her younger cousins, I have never in my world seen so many fanatical baseball players. It is amazing how fanatical baseball players. My, one of her cousins he's like 14 now. He recently came to our house. And he literally just wanted to drive by one of the minor league teams in our city, the Durham Bulls. He just wanted to drive by the stadium just to see the stadium. But that's how fanatical he was about baseball. But
Where's the American white kids that are that fanatical about that particular?
But my overall point is not that there's anything inherently wrong with contributionism, but it offers a limited response to the dominant hegemony. Because we think that it's just a question of the historical achievements in order to prove our worth to the nation. But think about it. I do this with my students all the time, so we're all students of philosophy, so I'll do this with you guys. Who's the first African American to get the Nobel Peace Prize?
Ralph Bunche.
Ralph Bunche. What did he get it for?
I forget.
He gets it for negotiating the Palestine peace agreement in the 1940s and 50s, working on behalf of U.S. imperialism. But the same Ralph Bunche that we celebrate is the same Ralph Bunche that opened up the door of possibility for Patrice Lumumba to be killed in the Congo. Right? So we're going to celebrate Bunche because, well, don't get me wrong, Bunche was brilliant. I mean, his political science was brilliant when it leaned leftward. After that, he's garbage. But the overall point I want you to see is that if you take dignity as the centerpiece of this recognition of everyone's self-worth, then an excessive form of dignity may be seen as false pride or contributionism. And you can see the kind of ad absurdum of this today, where 2025, we're still supposed to celebrate, oh, look, Beyonce is the first billionaire. Well, what does that really mean in the overall context of things that we're kind of still celebrating these black firsts in that kind of way? So that's one way in which we can look at the distortion of dignity and how it's expressed politically. On the other hand, if we were to look at the deficiency, and I'll try not to spend that much time on this because I don't think it deserves as much attention, but I also think it does deserve the attention. One of the interesting developments that I think has happened in the last 30 years or so is what I'm calling a kind of deficiency of dignity, and that is the fetishism of suffering, particularly in an African American context, but we could see other contexts in which this emerged. Think, for example, if we were to kind of broaden our lens, the lost cause, right? When we think of the Confederacy and this kind of sense in which you have some people that are beholden to this idea of a kind of romantic idea about the Confederacy, that they really weren't trying to fight to keep slavery, they were fighting to keep Southern dignity and blah, 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 blah. So we can see it very clearly in that sense where you might see this as a kind of distorted, deficient conception of dignity. But if we look at the Afro-pessimist, and I think this is just so bizarre because at the end of the day, I think when we look at the Afro-pessimist, what we have to recognize is that the Afro-pessimists as a school of thought are black versions of bourgeois scholasticism, but they're also a very clear sense sophists. They know how to make an appealing argument seem convincing. Because who wants to deny that black people have been treated with indignity, right? You go, man, no, they ain't, black people being treated like it sounds like Fox News, primetime, you want to deny that black people have been treated in a particular way. But I do think that if we, and I'm going to give some examples of this, I do think that it's kind of interesting when you look at this, that the Afro-pessimists have turned dignity into trauma porn. And what I mean by that is that we're supposed to look at capitalist slavery as only about dehumanizing indignity, the brutality of white people. And I have a hard time playing the kind of oppression Olympics game because we can go tit for tat with these kind of stories. History books are full of stories with the development of the textile industry in North Carolina. You know, one of the most grueling jobs of the textile industry was the little kids that they had to get to go up under the textile, that when the textile got knotted, these little kids had to go up under there and untie the knot. And in many instances, those little kids were killed. So we can go tit for tat for these kind of stories about oppression and exploitation. But the problem that I find with the Afro-pessimists is that, and we could talk to about other people like Anthony Appiah, it's a paradox without a solution, right? Endless suffering is supposed to be taken as some kind of proof of authenticity, but then what's the possibility of liberation? How do you re-achieve dignity given what they consider to be an endless suffering, right? And I'm gonna give you one example, but it almost surprised me if I didn't have the extra time this week, this year, because I've just been sitting around, but I can't be.
Oh, go ahead and brag on
I can't ignore this. But I find to be in our own midst, probably one of the most prominent people who adopts this label of Afro-pessimist is Tommy Curry. My argument still holds bourgeois scholasticism and sophistry. Now, by no means do I want to say that this is the centerpiece of his argument and the man not, but it's a very important part of it, is his treatment of Eldridge Cleaver. And what I find interesting is that this is once again one of those examples of sophistry. In fact, if we were to really label Tommy, we'd actually have to say that Tommy is an anti-philosopher. He's actually very good at, as Plato would say, he's often very good at taking on the form of the philosopher, but he does not adhere to the base criteria of what it means to be a philosopher. Their logical coherence, rational consistency, all of those kind of characteristics are missing when you look at Tommy's overall project here. Now, I want to point to the Eldridge, this is from chapter 2, and I want you to look at the introduction that he gives. Where did he put it at? Okay, here we go. This is so interesting. Despite his impact on the development of Black power and African American civil rights organizations in the 1960s and 1970s, and we'd have to actually ask the question, what was Eldridge's contribution? That's an interesting way to put that. But anyway, Cleaver's insights and works have been reduced to the ramblings of a self-admitted rapist. The identity politics of today and the hegemonic force of this, what does boy sound like he need to be on Fox News? Have made Cleaver into an archetype of the Black Panther Party and the pursuit of black men over the past 6 days. Now, first of all, who sees Eldridge Cleaver as the archetype of who black men are? That's a very important question. Now, Anthony and I have conversations about this all the time. I don't mean to throw you under the bus too, but take it to be the moral position of all progressive scholars, these mythologies have persisted without challenge and without little attention to the erasure of the sexualized violence of Jim Crow and American segregation that Cleaver and other black writers were reacting to. Now, this is a long sentence for one, but number two, did you pay attention to that? Cleaver is often dismissed. Here's my translation. Cleaver is often dismissed as a rapist because he talks about being a self-admitted rapist. But that's all product of identity politics and blah, blah, blah. We got to get to the real story. Well, let's look at the real story. Very interesting, because we're talking about this issue about dignity. Now, Cleaver was a good writer. I wouldn't say he was phenomenal, but he starts off by talking about what he was learning while he was in jail. He had opportunity, unlike today's prisoners, he had an opportunity to read some good books. And can you imagine today, people in prison talking about, I was reading Bakunin, and I was reading the catechisms, and I even had a chance to read some Machiavelli too. That's not what we normally hear. So, Cleaver's setting it up. Somehow I arrived at the conclusion that as a matter of principle, it was of paramount importance for me to have an antagonistic, ruthless attitude towards white women. The term outlaw appealed to me. And at the same time, my probate was drawing near, I considered myself to be mentally free. I was an outlaw. He's outside civil society. He's not just outside of the law, he's outside of civil society. That means he has no sense of dignity because he's not willing to respect other people's self-worth. So he says, I had stepped outside of the white man's law, which I repudiated with scorn and self-satisfaction. He's an outlaw. He doesn't believe in law anymore. I became a law unto myself, my own legislature, my own Supreme Court, my own executive. At the moment I walked out of the prison gates, my feelings, to get back on the earlier discussion about feelings, toward white women in general could be summed in the following lines. He writes this poem. We ain't gonna get to that poem, but this is mind-blowing. I never forget when I read this at the age of 16. I put the book down after that. I said, this woman is crazy. I became a rapist. To refine my technique in modus operandi, I started out by practicing on black girls in the ghetto, In the black ghetto, where dark and vicious deeds appear not as aberrations or deviations from the norm, but as part of the sufficiency of the evil of a day. And when I considered myself smooth enough, I crossed the tracks and sought out white prey. I did this consciously, deliberately, willingly, methodologically. Though looking back, I see that I was in a frantic, wild, and completely abandoned frame of mind. Now here's the thing. There is not any sane person who operates within the frame of law that believes rape, whether it happens to men or women, is allowed. Right? Now here's the kicker, and this is where I say sophistry on his part. This is grotesque, it's exaggerated, it's all of those things. I take Eldridge as a word because we've seen Eldridge's crazy life, so I take him at his word. But here's the thing. Two things can be true at the same time. Black men could have been sexually victimized, and women could have too. And there's no contradiction. If we're going to look at the history of oppression and exploitation throughout the world, we know that both men, women, and children have all been impacted by that. So there's nothing controversial here. It's the fact that he chooses to kind of ground himself in the grotesque. That's the only difference here. But here's the thing, I'm meant to bring this point out earlier. Think of African Americans created one of the most unique literary forms called the slave narrative. The slave narratives are never just one story about one gender being abused. Douglass brings that out brilliantly. Douglass is a child watching his Aunt Hester be beaten. That's trauma. That's just like if today we said somebody saw a drive-by shooting, they'd be traumatized. That's not an either-or question. Both things can be true at the same time. But in order for us to listen to Tommy and help him get to Edinburgh, you didn't hear me say that out loud. He had to manufacture his anger at this. And mind you, when you read the beginning of the book, he spends 2 pages telling, I see black dead people like we're in a movie or something like that. Anyway, my overall point here is that when we look at the development of this notion of dignity in the context of African American history, there's an interesting way in which we see these polars develop out of that. And what's often overlooked, and this would be one of the centerpiece critiques I have of Tommy's work, one of the most important autobiographies of the 20th century is the autobiography of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X offers us a way out of this dilemma. Malcolm X doesn't remain stuck in racial chauvinism. He's had enough of the racial metaphysics. That the black man is divine. He ain't going back to Elijah Muhammad after he leaves Elijah Muhammad. But on the flip side to that, he's also recognized he's not going to the kind of blind liberal universalism in terms of how he's looking at this. He's looking at it in concrete social relations, and that's determining how he understands dignity. And what does Malcolm offer us as one of his signature political programs? He is going, first of all, he makes a crucial political distinction. And I think this is crucial because we see Malcolm moving faster than King from a political theology of oppression to a political theory of liberation. And what he says is, our struggle is no longer a civil rights struggle. It's a human rights struggle. And he puts that in the context of what? The national oppression, the imperialism that is going on throughout the world. And so one of the things that Malcolm says very clearly towards the end of his life is like, I used to look at this stuff in terms of racial politics. So I thought it was black against white. But then he's very clear. And if you look at the makeup of the Organization of Afro-American Unity towards its end, it's actually a revolutionary organization you should kind of study. First of all, everywhere within that organization, women played a central role in the Organization of Afro-American Unity, but it was also multi-ethnic. So think about it. You got Yuri Kochiyama. Malcolm was involved in correspondence with Julian Mayfield's wife, which I can't think of her name now, but she was Puerto Rican. So he was developing connections with Puerto Rico and their anti-imperialist struggle. There's some complexity here when we begin to talk about turning this into a human rights struggle, because now we don't get caught up in whether or not, we don't play the politics of recognition. We're playing the politics of liberation. And that's where I think we've stagnated in terms of our analysis, is that we've kind of filtered on these two poles, if you will, of dignity. And we feel like we have a right to kind of relish in that dignity. But as we can see, if we were making this much more practical, look at the deficiency if we move beyond Afro-pessimism, just to get back to some of Leonard's concerns. And I think Leonard and I share this as a generational kind of overlap. If you look at the last 50 years, I never thought that I would actually enjoy watching the Cosby Show. But you know why I enjoy watching the Cosby Show? Because I can't take reality TV. It's so degrading. I see dignity, despite all the faults of the Cosby Show, not Bill Cosby. He's an abstract character in this whole narrative. But there's a sense of dignity that you saw in the Cosby Show that has completely disappeared from contemporary society, particularly Black intercultural productions. But here's where we get the extremes develop. How many of you seen Spike Lee? And I'll close out on this. Spike Lee's latest movie is Highest to Low. If you go see it, what strikes you, as I was pointing out earlier, Spike Lee is the master of imagery. Go back to School Days, you watch the first 2 minutes of School Days. It's all of these great portraits of what African Americans have accomplished, all the obstacles that they had to overcome. My grandmother used to always tell me, obstacles are nothing for a high stepper. That used to be her thing. No, don't get down, baby. You gotta work twice as hard. You're a high stepper, baby. That's the sense of dignity that my grandmother was always trying to instill in me. So there's a sense in which when I saw School Days, I identified that. But I didn't recognize that it was a false sense of dignity. It wasn't actually developed in the context of a human rights struggle. So I'll close with that. I hope I didn't skirt over anything, but there's other details that I could have had. Thank you so much.
All right. Ed has a question. I saw his hand first.
I'm still formulating. I have a question. Let's go.
And I think I saw you. I wasn't digital.
You beat him this time.
Please don't use the verb beat in anyone in this room. So does Pan? So I get like there's like a dialectical movement. So does something like Pan-African liberation and maybe all liberation require a concept of dignity? And if I'm understanding your talk, and this is just a question of understanding, you're still thinking through the dialectic. You haven't proposed what dignity is or should be,
precisely.
but you're kind of in this like excess and deficiency, like an Aristotelian moment where you're saying like there's these cultural moments, right?
He was using, you know, that's what he said last night.
What?
The Aristotelian.
Yeah, no, it's clear that, you know, it's one of my favorite books. So anyway, so
I
but
think
do you have
that's-
so I guess my question is, do you have an inclination, even if it's not fully fleshed out, as to how to instill dignity in a dialectical conception,
Right.
or liberation politics,
Right.
or a concept of liberation politics, and not a conception of the politics of recognition that you get like from a Hegelian kind of framework?
I think the reason that we're having such a hard problem defining dignity, particularly in concrete terms, is because given certain historical conditions, social conditions, what dignity means in each period changes. So for example, and it's a reflection of the larger class struggle. So I'll give you a stupid example, and maybe some of you can remember this. When I grew up, a lot of kids my age watch reruns of Good Times TV. And when you think back on it as an adult, you kind of are dumbfounded. We're supposed to believe that the most political person in the family is Michael. You got a grown man who's going to work every day, dealing with indignity every day of his life. But Michael is the, hey, we got to do the Black Jesus. No. My point is that in that context, what happens is as people begin to reject that Good Times narrative, media responded in a different kind of way to offer you something different. For my generation, I would say, and this is a complex way in which it worked its way out, we got Flavor Flav instead of Dynamite.
So I guess there's also an implicit question here of like, does Blackish have conceptions of dignity?
That's the central class question. Do you take a petty bourgeois conception of dignity as the centerpiece of what dignity is? Because they've actually distorted it in the sense in which they talk about what's dignity in there. A good part of the dignity of Blackish is the fact that they have wealth and nobody else has it. Right? So it's, you know.
I'm not coming with you anywhere you want. But it's not my turn to my question yet.
All right, I'm done.
So, part of the end of where we get to about sort of what is dignity, what isn't, goes back to where you start. And you say, sometimes that we were, whatever we're viewing, or when people are thinking of themselves as dignified, etc., we call it false. But it's false dignity. But even in this exchange you just had, it's not clear to me what then would not be false dignity on your account, right? Because you are, you have a prescription against, say, the reality TV folks, but the Cosby Show is more bearable for you because there's some enactment of dignity, but it's false. Even in this sort of exchange, you just talked about Good Times, and I can so see why the 12-year-old has the opportunity to think of himself as revolutionary and his father does not.
Right.
We can talk about it
Right.
at another time. I want to know about the falseness, right? So if dignity is in some ways the good that obtains in sort of sociality, in the conditions of whatever that is, what then is false, right?
So that's the
What makes it
context.
false? I want to know.
That's the
what
context
false
of
is.
the struggle liberation movement. Let me not put it in those kind of archaic terms. First, you have to define what is the goal of liberation
To be liberated.
in order to define what dignity is. So think about it this way.
So
The reason I can make the observation about the Cosby Show is that as a working class kid in Kansas City, Missouri, while my mother made me watch the Cosby Show, I rejected the Cosby Show because of its bourgeois character as a kid. But as I got older, I developed a much more nuanced understanding of it in relationship to the changes that had happened, and not just in terms of media, but who Black people are today. We are not the Black people of the 1980s anymore. We're 40 years removed from that. We're not a unified people.
I was gonna say, I don't know that we aren't. Because, so, and I don't wanna take up. But one of the things that I'm challenged by your account, isn't, I actually really, it tickles my brain to think about the pieces and the pieces, the excessiveness. We can go lots of places, but especially when we talk about sort of the interpretation of Black life through cultural forms, and whether or not people have or perform dignity in a certain way, I keep hitting a wall when I hear you talk about it, because you clearly have a set of valuations based on what is dignified and not, whether it's internal to
There's no
the
presupposition.
concept or not.
I just didn't develop those presuppositions.
And because it's underdeveloped, I wonder sort of on what grounds should we come with you, right? Because
Because I'm beautiful.
I want to suggest to you that even your
No, I am serious. I'm joking.
I like that. Wait till you tell me you talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
We haven't had enough time to be together. You'll understand. So, but I want to say, especially the editorializing part when you talk about dignity, the conception that I hear from my very poor, working class, crack 80s Richmond, Virginia born
Right.
self is really bourgeois, right? That the things that you have pointed out as the thing that you would prefer sound like dignity.
Oh, well, I mean, I can
of a
clarify
certain-
that. I mean,
of a certain sort.
I went over that very quickly, but one of the hallmarks of the Cosby Show is that it has a very deep understanding of black culture through the people that came on the show, from Dizzy Gillespie to Stevie Wonder to even some of the underlying cultural dynamics. But it's all cast in a petty bourgeois form, which you can't find today in most black TV shows, with that kind of complexity that you gotta peel away. Probably the closest that comes to it in terms of contemporary would probably be the Boondocks or Atlanta.
Ooh, okay, so we have to have a whole time. All right, go to somebody else.
What's petty bourgeois about it other than their socioeconomic status?
That's the core content.
Okay, so.
Yeah, that's the con, you gotta, that's
When you
the,
say petty bourgeois, that's what I said.
Yeah, you got it.
He's a doctor, she's a lawyer, they're petty bourgeois.
I don't know your background in this respect, but, and I grew up I was fortunate of growing in a city that you could go to museums, that was common for school trips, all that. But when's the first time that you ever saw a black piece of artwork that was made by a major painter or artist in someone's house or a family member?
Never saw it in Zoom.
Never saw it till when?
Never saw it in Zoom.
Oh, I mean, so think about that. The Ellis painting, no, I'll even back and forth. You know the first time I saw a Ernie Barnes painting in someone's house? My best friend, his father was the city councilman in Kansas City, Missouri. They had real money, right? Now, I was just looking like, man, I've seen Ernie Barnes before, but you know how I seen Ernie Barnes? My mother's artwork that she used to put on her wall, she used to cut stuff out of Essence magazine and put it in a frame and put it up on the wall. But I never saw black art like that where you could purchase it in that kind of way until I saw the Cosby Show. But my point is that there's these complexities like we were talking about earlier. Where can you find in black culture today where you could find a complex discussion about the importance of quilting for a certain generation of black people?
So you got quilts, then that's different, I got different answers to your question. You asked about portraiture.
Yeah, no, I'm just.
Oh, I had a question. Well, did you?
Oh, go ahead.
Let me go first. And then
Sir,
If you said it was a limited conception of dignity with dying creatures, as opposed to a false one. When you say false,
Yeah.
it's more machine. What's true?
I think
And
that's
I want a long description. I want one sentence.
right.
But so don't, I'm saying, maybe the problem is calling it false as opposed to limited.
Right. I think that's.
that was it.
Yeah, if I shift that one word,
the children
then
of black
okay.
parents.
Yes.
That's false.
You said it.
Where's the truth?
Where's the truth?
So
I'm through.
now, here's the other complexity.
Go to the next person.
The other complexity here, and I think you're right, language matters in this instance. I was trying to be poetic and trying to find words that rhyme with dignity. So my original conception was vanity versus indignity. That was the original way in which I wanted to frame it. But when you concretize this and you're thinking about this dialectically, it actually presents itself as false.
I'm sitting back with her.
Well, look, I'll put it this way. All right, let me,
I need to know what false is.
This-
All right.
If you have a.
put it this way. Let's say, for example,
In terms of not being sufficiently fleshed out as a law, limited to a certain class, etc. But if you use the term false,
right.
it means bad, wrong, misguided, period.
But think about it in the context.
And then you turn around and say,
Right.
what's the good parts of it?
But
You
see,
you don't mean false.
well, no. So think about it. The point I was trying to make with Malcolm X and Curry is this. You get a completely different narrative if Malcolm is the centerpiece of your black male studies than if you use Eldridge and James Baldwin. The reason he uses Eldridge and James Baldwin is because they're ambiguous figures, morally. What I mean by that morally is that how would you
do narrative about one way or the other?
You're avoiding a term, false or not.
I mean, I can go with limited. Limited works.
Okay.
Yeah, limited. I mean, if you want me to use Hegelian Marxist language, it's one-sided.
You just said mediated, and it's.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. But that's what, when you think about the mediation, it is the way in which you're looking at the relationship between appearance and essence. Appearance is not unreal. The appearance is real. It's very real.
Oh, and that's maybe illusory is something closer to that.
Yeah.
Or false consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's very real. Like, the sense in which, think about it. There are a lot of African Americans who identify with a movie like Wakanda. They're like, man, this gives me pride, dignity.
Yeah.
But it's a false sense of dignity.
I'm gonna struggle.
You struggle with the
I don't know what.
We're struggling with the term false.
Here's my point. Perception of dignity, but they're all going to be contrivances of something.
It's an internalization of black people who look at.
Okay, what's the non-contrived version look like?
the non-contrived version of
Anything.
okay.
So, right, so
That's just the same question I asked. Like,
No.
You seem to be faulting them all for being contrivances of a sort.
So,
What's the-
I give you a concrete example of how this plays out in terms of American political history.
No, that won't work.
That might be false.
Let me offer
Yeah, that's false. I think that here's where the problem would be. If you put this out in common, company,
Right.
culture, whatever, when someone else reads this, that is not a philosopher, are they gonna agree with it? And they're gonna pick up your point, or are they gonna pick up what they're saying? And if they're gonna pick up what they're saying, then you may need to change the word.
Yeah, I think it's valid about false, but this is the difference. Is I'm coming out of a different philosophical framing. So when I think of false, I don't think of it as a false.
As a negation.
Yeah, I don't think of it as unreal. It's speaking to a very real need in the context of an oppressive society.
You're thinking like almost like what Derrida does with the symbols in chapter 2. Gotcha.
In an oppressive, exploitive society where people don't have dignity, there is a genuine need to feel dignified. And that sometimes gets contorted into Wakanda. Sometimes it gets distorted into, well, at the end of the day, my oppression is much more deeper than yours and it's everlasting.
So the symbolic works is instead of the actual material. Whatever.
But maybe the thing of false, when I'm thinking of false, I'm thinking of it in the sense of, and for lack of a better, you're gonna beat me over the head on this one too, true dignity. But I'm thinking,
If you would stop this, okay? I would be because my question is different than yours. I was
another
looking
problem
at
is
this.
you coming in and saying, you know your first flourishing or virtuous. So you want dignity and liberation. You know what liberation is, but liberation requires
That's the question.
That's the
That's the question. Can we only achieve true dignity outside of capitalism?
oh yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
That's like asking him.
But that explains number one.
Right.
Why I still think
Right.
we will fundamentally disagree for lots of reasons. But now I totally understand the world in which you would have it.
Right.
And so, in our translation to one another, false means exactly what I thought. And I understand why it works for you and why it won't work for me. That was all right.
Did you, I know, did you still have yours?
They help
Okay.
that I want to say. So,
Jacoby, yes, we're gonna run into the next section, but that's okay, because it's just a workshop. It's a discussion
open
section.
discussion.
I don't have to ask him. I can hold it
Let's just
No,
discuss
no, no,
it.
go ahead.
We're just
It's
discussing
discussion,
it.
so-
So,
so-
the question was, towards the end, it seemed to me that you suggested that, yeah, not to admire us in previous, but that true dignity would be had as a result of the shift that Malcolm saw.